Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Roberson, and welcome to another Books and Ballots conversation. We're all really excited that you're here. For those of you who don't know, Books and Ballots is our space where we research and real-world election practices meet. It's a place for elevating academic insights and translating them into the day-to-day work of election officials and those who study democracy. Today's session continues that mission, taking rigorous research, opening it up, and having an honest, accessible conversation about what it means for the field of elections. A few logistics before we begin. Some folks are still joining us, but this session is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards. Feel free to drop questions into the Q&A at any time. We will weave them in as we go, and we also have a designated section at the end for anyone that we may have forgotten. Today, we are exploring vote centers. Our goal in the next hour is to bring clarity, our goal in the next hour is to bring clarity and create a space for conversation across perspectives. We are joined by a wonderful panel. Scott Jarrett is the Director of Elections in Maricopa County, Arizona. Eric Fay is the Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri. Anita Mannion is a political science professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and David Kimball is a political science professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis as well. These experts will guide us through their work and what it means for election officials, policymakers, and researchers alike. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and kick things over to Kyle for today's discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rebecca, and hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Yoder. I'm the Associate Research Director at the Center for Election Innovation and Research. For those of you who don't know us, CEIR is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works with state and local election officials around the country on both sides of the aisle. Our research supports election officials with practical analysis about election administration and works to inform the public about how elections actually work in order to increase confidence in our election system. I am also very excited to be continuing our partnership with the Elections Group and ASU's Mechanics of Democracy Lab on the Books and Ballots series, and even more excited to be here today with such a great group. Scott, Eric, I am sure everybody listening in is chomping at the bit to hear what you have to say, but I do want to give Anita and David a chance to set the stage with about 5 minutes of their research. So Anita, I think you have slides. I'll go on mute and hand things over to you real quick.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. So I am going to be very brief because I know you want to hear from the actual practitioners, but David Kimball and I were both professors at University of Missouri St. Louis, and we just wanted to share a brief overview of what we have found in our research about vote centers and what others have found in their research. So just briefly, almost all states now allow vote centers, and most adopted them during or after the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see on this chart how we had some surges in years before 2020, but really the significant adoption happening in 2020 and in the subsequent election in 2024. And we're putting together a database with help from our graduate student, Jake Shaw, thank you, Jake, on all local jurisdictions that use election day vote centers. And what we found is about a third are in vote by mail states in the West, where relatively few people vote in person on election day. And the rest are mostly in the Midwest and Plain states where most people vote in person. So these are the states that we found, and we went ahead and put together this map of the jurisdictions that are currently using vote centers. And we found that at least 625 counties serving over 69 million voters have adopted vote centers for election day voting in 19 states. So you can kind of see that geographic spread that we were talking about in this map. Another thing that we found is that vote centers are more common in large jurisdictions. And so we'll use as an example, my home state of Missouri, and you can see those gray dots are in St. Louis City and County and Kansas City, which are the population centers. So why have we seen this surge in vote centers? Well, there are budget pressures that have happened in recent years after the 2020 election. States such as Missouri passed laws that made it impossible to access things like Zuckerbucks or things anymore. Also concerns about rejected ballots, but more than that, concerns about poll worker recruitment and venues that didn't want to host polling places, particularly that was a problem in 2020. And so when we look at our research and the body of research around vote centers, what we find is that switching to vote centers tends to reduce election costs. associated with payroll and ballot printing. So you're downsizing the number of polling places and poll workers, so that cuts costs. You print ballots on demand, so you don't have sort of that waste. But there are some potential increased costs on things like voter education as well. There's been some research that shows modest gains in voter turnout, other that find no effect. So overall, there's no clear impact on voter turnout. Vote centers don't appear to increase or decrease voter turnout. There is research that indicates some voters travel further distance to vote, which makes sense because there are fewer polling places. But thinking about issues of equity and who's driving further is a consideration that's recommended when implementing vote centers as well. And then their vote centers tends to reduce the number of provisional ballots and rejected provisional ballots. You can't show up at the wrong polling place unless you're in the wrong county. And so that makes things a little smoother for voters and poll workers. And to that extent, vote centers seem to be popular, at least in places where the rollout is fairly smooth. We've conducted surveys of voters and poll workers in St. Louis County, Missouri, and Fresno County, California, after the last two general elections, and both groups report very positive experiences with vote centers. Over 70% of voters and over 90% of poll workers prefer vote centers to the regular assigned precinct polling places. And the majority of voters in both counties also said they thought vote centers make elections more secure. There's fewer people involved, fewer locations, so it feels more secure. But the most important thing is, as Scott and Eric are going to tell us about, adopting vote centers requires coordinating changes in basically all aspects of election administration. You have to think about your technology, logistics, poll worker training, all these communication to voters. And when all of those changes are well planned and well executed, implementation tends to go smoothly. But when those are not, it can be messy. And so with that, I will turn the conversation to Scott and Jared, who can speak to that experience.
Well, Eric, you want me to jump in and just sort of start with sort of my thoughts on this, and then we can go back and forth. And Anita and David, I really appreciate those slides. I learned a few things from that, and I love your use of visuals and the graphics. So we in Maricopa County, we implemented vote centers right in the peak of, I guess, when people are implementing vote centers in 2020 as a result of us, and just like most jurisdictions, we're wanting to put voting locations in assisted living centers, nursing homes, and schools, and we lost access to all of those. And so we were a precinct-based model up until that point in time. We introduced vote centers, and we've really never looked back because we really appreciate and like the vote center model. But it does come with some complications. But I would say, and it's not for every jurisdiction. I think Maricopa County, there are some things, and maybe even in the states that are in the West, that it makes it easier to implement vote centers. One of those is, like, Maricopa County has been one of the fastest growing counties in the country. So we have a lot of transient voters. So people that are voting in Maricopa County or Arizona for the first time, right? So they don't have this long history of voting in elections and expecting, okay, I'm always going to go to this exact same precinct, right? So we still have that, and people always wanting to go back to the place that they voted before. But because we have a highly transient voting population, our challenges of communicating is less so. And then one of the things is, since you're always in the right location with a voting location, it's not as important to have to get as much communication out. Now, we do invest in a lot of communication, and it does then allow you to really leverage things like your website and wait times and apps that people can have on their phone, or I guess a functional website that people can use on their smartphone to find convenient locations, right, and how they search it. And I'd love to get into some details about lessons that we've learned about how we search things, how we provide that access to people, because when you give people choice, and then they're using a website that they only use once every 2 years, or maybe twice every 2 years, it's not as easy for voters to write a website that they visit all the time, like their favorite online clothes shopping place, they know exactly how to use it. Or if they're into sports and they go to ESPN and they know how to read the box score, they already know how to use those types of things. But when they're actually having to get information and figure out how to use a website, that is, I think, one of the bigger challenges that we're still having to figure out and to make it easier for voters to use. The last thing I'll leave it with before we get into some of the discussion, I turn over to Eric. I think we as election officials, and this is probably universal the same, we're looking for these basic tenets in election, right? You want to have a secure election. You want to provide ease of access for voters to be able to participate. You want to have a reliable election. You want to have a transparent election. You want to have an efficient election, meaning both cost effective, but also speed and fast, right? So you're looking at making decisions. And anytime you make a decision, right, usually there's this equal and opposite reaction, right? So you improve transparency, you harm security, right? And in my view, vote centers in the right area actually is one of the decisions that you can improve all five of those at once. Now, there are a few trade-offs, but it definitely improves reliability, improves access, improves security, improves efficiency, and all those transparency. That might be one of the areas that it's not quite as, depending on how you're viewing what transparency means. But for sure, those other four tenets, vote centers in the right circumstance, improve all of those. And so if you can make a decision that improves 4 out of the 5 and doesn't really harm the fifth, I'm all in. So, and I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more, but I want to give a chance for Eric to say a few words on his thoughts on vote centers, and we can get into the nitty-gritty about challenges, benefits, those types of things.
And thanks, Scott. St. Louis County was one of those COVID adopters that you saw on Anita's slide there. And it was all based on resiliency. If there's one word I can use to sum up the advantage of vote centers, it's resiliency for election administrators. I think Neil Kelly, former registrar out in Orange County, California, put it to me once. He felt like every election he was replicating the worst elements of the DMV, at every polling location. And that it was like a light bulb went off. I'm like, that is exactly what I'm doing. The voting experience in St. Louis County was at best suboptimal, and things would happen that were not at all the fault of the voters. A kitchen fire in a school cafeteria. I had an election where a police chase ended in the parking lot of a polling place, and they shut off, the parking lot for hours, and people couldn't vote, and they had nowhere else to go, and it was not the fault of the voters at all. And as an election administrator, that just kills you when that kind of stuff happens. So, like I said, in 2020, we implemented vote centers. In 2020, Missouri allowed voters to vote by mail with no excuse. That law has since sunset, but Missouri does not have early voting. So our transition to vote centers coincided with alternative options for voting. So both in 2020 and last year in 2024, 40 to 50% of our voters voted prior to election day, whether by mail or early voting in person. And that has helped us to be able to also reduce the number of polling locations on election day. We cut it in about half in 2020. We've been able to maintain that because so many people are voting prior to election day. So yes, that has enabled us to cut down the number of polling locations, which reduces the amount of poll workers you need, the amount of election equipment you need in some cases. Not always. Where we used to have maybe one ballot scanner in a polling location prior, now we have two because there's a greater throughput there. But yeah, at the end of the day, I just go back to that resiliency thing, and I think it was in our primary election in 2022, we had flash flooding the week before the election that knocked out 6 of our polling locations. We just put up signs in front of those buildings that said, this place has been flooded. You got to vote somewhere else. And we put several other, like a half dozen other options just down the street for people to go to. And it just, well, I'll stop there because I know there are questions and everything, and I could just talk forever. So I'll stop there. And yeah, I don't know who's kind of moderating, but let them take it.
Sure, I'll take it back here for a bit. And just, I mean, thank you both for explaining your experience, and thank you, Anita, again for the context nationally. Eric, I actually want to pick up something that you said, which was resiliency. And I saw a lot of nods from other panelists, and I wanted Scott, yeah, in particular, I'm curious, does that word wasn't one of the five that you listed off, but it seems like it resonated with you.
Well, I thought I said reliability, but maybe I can have those
Yeah.
correlate very closely. Right. Absolutely. Because, and well, Eric's exactly right. Every election official can talk about the horror stories of having voting locations not opening and all the reasons why. It's the full gamut, right? And things that you can't even imagine of why a voting location isn't opening. And when you're in a precinct-based model, right, then you're having to scramble to how are you going to serve those voters? You're finding a nearby precinct that hopefully is large enough that you can have now a co-located precinct operating out of it. Or you're setting up a tent in a parking lot, right, to allow voting to occur within that tent. Within a vote center model, you've already got the location, right? Eric explained it perfectly about you hire fewer people, but you don't have less equipment. And actually, we've had to expand the number of pieces of equipment. We're actually offering more check-in stations than we ever have, more voting booths in our voting locations than we ever have. We've been able to find more parking spaces than we ever have because we're able to find the right type of location to serve as a vote center. And then if one of them goes down, right, it's not now moving this entire operation and all the pre-printed ballots and all of those types of things to get it to another location. You've already got another location. You've got 250 other locations, depending on the number you have. We have 250 in Maricopa County. So you have 250 other locations that voters can choose from, and they're already open, ready to serve. So I think that is one of the huge advantages and value adds from a vote center model.
On that kind of choosing the right location bit, I have a few thoughts, but can you just explain a little bit more about like what makes for a good vote center location? Talk a little bit more about, yeah,
So
choosing of the location. Yeah.
I'll go first, then Eric. And I could probably spend 4 hours just talking about this and how you choose your locations. But like in a precinct-based environment, a lot of the work on identifying where is developed when you're developing the precincts, right? And sometimes that ends up being politics and a lot of politics involved in that. With vote centers, you end up removing a lot of then that politics, and it really allows you to use data to drive where those locations are. So you can use turnout history from where those in-person voters live, right? And then you can find out, once you have more and more data, you can find out, well, where do those in-person voters vote? Not necessarily where they live, right? And then you can use that to inform, okay, this is where I'm going to search. I really need locations within this area because, and you can use all this great data that you can overlap and say, we're going to have a lot of in-person voters in this area and we don't have enough, right? So that's one of the big factors is where do those in-person voters live and where do they vote? And the next is then identifying, which would be very similar to, I think, a lot of other jurisdictions, whether it's precinct or a vote center, but putting them along like public transportation lines, putting them along freeway where you have lots of but freeways, but also then making sure that you're not only serving your urban area voters, like Maricopa County, we're 9,600 square miles. So we do have a very urban centric cities with City of Phoenix, Mesa, 23 different cities within Maricopa County. We have very rural communities as well because we're larger than 7 states geography wise. And so we have to make sure that we are putting locations to serve our Native American communities in those very rural locations. They still operate as a vote center model. But one of the challenges I will say now, though, is making sure that you have poll workers that understand the technology that can work in that very rural environment. And now what we've had to do is sometimes supplement, right? And find poll workers that are willing to drive 45 miles are an hour and a half to a voting location and paying them mileage to do that. And in some cases, we actually even rent a hotel room, right? If it's because we have this one community that's 2.5 hours from Phoenix, right? And they have to open up at 6 a.m. in the morning, and we're not confident that the poll workers are going to be able to open that up with all the added technology. So we get some really seasoned poll workers from Central Phoenix. We put them in a hotel that's an hour away from the location, and then they can drive to it. But so those are different considerations that we have. Obviously, ADA compliant, those other types of things. But I think the biggest thing is using data to now make decisions and using it at where the voting location is and not necessarily the geographic boundary of the precinct. Eric, your thoughts?
Well, Scott's exactly right. We've had a similar experience in terms of being able to use more data-driven decisions. Folks in my office that run our GIS functionality, they've been able to use those data Scott mentioned to make more informed decisions. And I think one added nuance about that I've loved in St. Louis County is that Missouri has a very close electioneering barrier. It's only 25 feet from the entrance to the polling location. So in some parts of our county, electioneering is like a full contact sport. It is very intimidating to the voters. We get that's most of our police activity during the day is dealing with electioneering and fights and arguments and stuff like that. And so quite often, and it was almost the worst things were in municipal elections, not the general election, it was municipal elections. And these little municipal officials would want polling places in their neck of the woods or in their building so they could kind of control that whole thing. And this has taken that power away from them, which I love. And so, just anecdotally, I've spoken to a number of voters that are like, yeah, I drive 10 miles now to get away from all of my elected officials so they don't bother me when I'm trying to vote and everything. They don't know who I'm voting for, they don't know that I'm there. So, that's one little nuance that's maybe St. Louis County unique that Scott didn't mention, but Scott made all the right points about this.
Um, Anita, you mentioned something during the slides, what that Scott touched upon, especially about some voters driving further distance to vote. But what Eric was just saying also reminded me of the point you made around voter confidence and voter satisfaction and like feeling better about the voting experience. What Eric just described would, as if I were voting, would feel a lot better about the voting experience for sure. Are there other factors that you're finding as well that are contributing to that?
Are you asking David and I?
Yeah, I'm asking David and you.
You know, again, anecdotally, as Eric said, we have a polling place on campus, and now that we have the vote centers, David and I kind of troll the line and talk to people, get a feel, and they have explicitly said like, "Oh, this feels safer." At our campus, you're waiting indoors. They like that. The metro, public transportation goes there. They like that. So, I do think there is that feeling of safeness, and like I mentioned in the survey, the idea of more increased voter confidence and thinking elections are secure seems to be attributed to the fact that like there's just fewer people touching the ballots. There's fewer polling places to bring them in from, that things just seem more kind of contained. David, did you have anything to add?
A lot of in St. Louis County, a lot of voters use the website or the app to check vote times. I think it's been in the hundreds of thousands in a general election. So a lot of people are checking it and using it and presumably going to a location that had a shorter wait, right? So that part of the point. I think that's been a plus. I think a second thing, at least in St. Louis County, because we've observed that most closely here, is that under the old system, some of the polling places were pretty small buildings, like a modular unit, or even like a converted, an old home that was converted to a city hall, maybe, and not really the greatest locations in the first place for voters, particularly if there's a long line. And vote centers, you're really forced to go to locations that have more space and more parking and can handle it bigger. And so I think that's also just made the voting experience in general better. Those are a couple things that we.
David, Anita, and Eric, I just want to provide, so, and this is all anecdotal. So right when I talked about those 5 areas, and I mentioned, well, maybe not transparency. Like, I think in some ways, depending again how you view what transparency means, you're providing wait times on our website, you're providing easy access of where people can choose to vote. Maybe you can couch that as being transparent, but I have heard anecdotally that some people have lost trust in their in-person voting location because they used to be able to walk in and see the teacher or their neighbor as being the poll worker. And because they had that one-on-one relationship with that person that's working the election, now they trust it. And now a vote center model, like we still, like on average, our voting locations are 1.18 miles, straight line distance from one another. I think driving distance, it's 2.2 miles from each of our voting locations. But that resonates with me, right? If I walk into, right now that we're since post 2020, it's just the amount of the way that inaccurate information can circulate around the internet and so quickly. And really, the person that you're going to trust is your coach, right? Your pastor, your neighbor, right? Your friend, those types of things. And now, if we've reduced that ability a little bit because they're a little bit more regional, that does resonate to me. So I think if there's been one criticism of the vote centers that I think may be valid, I think that's it, right? There's lots of challenges with vote centers, right? From technology and getting poll workers to be able to use all the different technology and having it reliably set up and all of those types of things. But you can overcome that if you have enough resources, right? And that's probably why most of the larger jurisdictions where they're being implemented because they have more resources. But I don't know. That would be interesting to do research to truly see, is there a correlation between voter trust and this regional vote center versus the community precinct?
I think to Scott's point, this is a very nuanced thing, probably based on the jurisdiction, because like I said, in our case in St. Louis County, that particular concern I haven't heard from voters. And I think that's mostly because prior to our adoption of vote centers, there were some parts of our county where election day ran very well and some parts where routinely it ran poorly. And even though in those communities the voters saw their friends and neighbors running the polling place, they were running it terribly. And the wait time was forever and they didn't have any other options. And so even though maybe they don't see their neighbor running their polling place anymore, it's not as terrible of an experience. And so that has, I think, outweighed that particular concern, especially in some parts of our community. But it's going to be a little bit different everywhere. And the political culture and the political traditions are different everywhere. So those are things you have to take into account.
I'm actually going to take that as an opportunity to preview a quick question from the Q&A that somebody has, which is, as you were implementing, both of you were COVID adopters, you said, when it came to vote centers, but how did you go about selling the idea to your communities, to your local politicians, your voters, your other stakeholders? Yeah, what advice might you have for folks looking to do the same now?
I can take that first. I don't know if our process was one to emulate necessarily, but I think we were very lucky that we did it during COVID. It made implementation and acceptability much easier and better. So I've admitted this publicly in the past, so I'll say it again now in this webinar. The first election where we implemented vote centers was 2020, our municipal elections, which were in the thick of COVID. We actually told nobody that we had done it. We didn't even tell the poll workers that it was the case. And voters just went to polling places and a bunch of them voted at the wrong polling place and they didn't even know it. And on that election day, we had one polling place that had some problems and a line backed up, and we sent some folks over there and we told the poll workers, go out and tell everybody in line they can just go to these other places down the street. And they said, well, can we do that? And I said, oh, it's a special COVID thing, just go ahead and tell them it'll happen. So and then moving into our primary and general election, then we did use a lot of earned media. We used the mailings that we already sent to voters to inform them of it. And I think, again, because it was during COVID, everybody saw it as an innovation from the election office that we were trying to help voters and work with them. And I don't remember any pushback at all. And once it worked so well, the political class accepted it and they like it. And cross party lines in our state legislature, our state reps and senators from St. Louis County defend our process in the state legislature when folks in other parts of the state seem not so keen on it, perhaps, because it does work so well for voters of all stripes.
I agree with Eric that COVID being the reason helped us being able to implement it. Now, COVID being the reason, sometimes people detract from that and use that as a reason no longer to use it. But our first time, so it was for our March presidential preference election. So it's not our primary election. So in Arizona, our election officials are by state law supposed to offer this for then the voters of Arizona to be able to then have their representatives and electors go and have the national convention, the delegates. So ours was in March. And it was the very same week that the NBA canceled their season, right? And I think the NCAA postponed their conference, right? All of these major entities were shutting down, and then also the CDC said you can no longer use nursing homes, assisted living centers, any of those for your voting locations. And we did a ping of our vote center, our poll workers, and we had about 60% of our poll workers say they weren't going to come to work. Right. And so we had about 5 days to reinvent the election. And thank goodness it was a presidential preference election. And our statute only required us to report results by congressional district, which we have 8 that overlap Maricopa County, and not by precinct. Because then because at that point in time, we're using pre-printed ballots. And all of them have been distributed. So we had to go back into voting locations and in some places break in to the location to get the pre-printed ballots that were in there that we couldn't use so we can distribute them out to the voting locations where we're like, okay, this voting location is right on the border of 3 CDs. We need this many congressional district ballots to issue to them correctly. And so we implemented that and we did it with such huge success. I mean, don't go watch my press conference before that because that's probably one of the worst things in my entire life, that press conference. We had like county employees volunteer to go stand outside voting locations with signs that we printed telling them where their nearest voting location. So we got so much goodwill for doing an election in COVID. And then our primary went off with a huge success as well. Vote centers going from 550 to 99, huge reduction, but that's what helped us sell it, right? But I mentioned now our legislature, they do think that vote centers are not, they really want to go back to precinct based. They've tried to implement laws preventing the use of vote centers. And in some ways, they use that COVID reason against us.
Well, I want to make sure that we get a chance to get to the Q&A. So I'll ask one more question that I have. And this is a reminder to everybody listening in. If you've got a question, get it into the Q&A. But while I still have the microphone, Scott and Eric, I'd love to hear, you've talked a little bit about your experience implementing vote centers, some of the trade-offs and challenges. I'm wondering, was there anything, what did you find most surprising about the switch? Is there anything that you would flag for an official at the local level, at the state level, someone who's thinking about moving their state, moving local jurisdictions to the vote centers, that they should, this might be unintuitive, but you should pay attention to this.
This is a call mostly for election administrators. So this is a very kind of in the weeds election administration thing. But overall, vote centers have been super positive for us. I would not change it for the world. The only thing that was made a little more complicated in the vote center model were recounts, especially recounts for offices that are not countywide. So at, individual state representative districts or city council races, things like that, because people can vote anywhere. Um, maybe there's a couple ballots at some far-flung polling location that, there were 1,000 ballots cast there. And when you're doing the recount, you got to go through that whole stack of ballots and find just those two. So it did slightly complicate the recount process, and it made that process a little more labor intensive. So that's something, if you're implementing vote centers, to think through prior to how you're going to organize ballots and organize things like that post-election. But yeah, overall, I say it, as for the administrators, it makes things so much easier, so much more resilient. Like I said before, that that far outweighs any challenge we saw in the back end.
So I mentioned this earlier, and so I take the opportunity to talk about it. And maybe it's a little surprising to me, but it probably shouldn't have been. And it was the complications of the website and informing voters how to use the website. And when they're like, because now you have all these options, right? You can type in an address and then it'll populate the closest locations. But then you have to decide, okay, I only want to return the closest open location, right? Because if you're returning all the locations in order, people won't necessarily know that they're open, right? So then we had to add banners over the ones that were closed, like a transparent see-through closed and transparent see-through open banner, right? And so making it easy for voters to use the functionality of the website. Like anytime you add a new functionality to it, then there's like everything has some unintended consequence. It makes it harder for someone else to use, right? And then you provide abilities to download the complete list of voting locations, all of these different avenues for them to get it. But one of the things we're all dealing with the swirling inaccurate information that goes out there. So we did add this wonderful in 2024 nice map of all of our voting locations now. So everyone uses maps, right? So not only is the dashboard that you can use your fingers to scroll into all the different maps. And then we have these flags that say whether they're open or closed, right? And in different colors. And during early voting, we don't have as many locations that are open. And even on Sundays because we're open for 4 weeks of early voting, the first few Sundays, we're not open at all. And right, so then we'd have like some of our drop boxes open. So we'd have like these two flags that said open and 250 closed flags. And now people then take screenshots of our website and saying, look, Maricopa County disenfranchising voters. These are like people with very prominent followings, right? And saying all the voting locations are closed on election day. So using our exact website against us, right? And again, trying to make things visually appealing and easy to use, but just being prepared for no matter, like, no good deed goes unpunished. Just watch Wicked. So that's right. I think she has that song in there, that statement. But people always using every avenue, like even though this benefits voters in so many ways, the detractors will use it all against you to try to spin their own narrative.
Well, we are getting bombarded with questions, so I'm going to open up the floodgates there. And the first one, I'll put it to the panelists, but then I'm going to answer one of these other ones myself here. The first one, to put it to you, Scott, Jarrett, and Anita and David, if you want to chime in, is Scott talked earlier about vote centers enhancing security. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? But before you answer that, somebody else joined us a little bit late and just asked a point of clarification what we mean when we're talking about vote centers, particularly for officials on the call who don't currently use vote centers. Anita, I see you nodding. Can I ask you to take that one?
Sure. Vote centers is sort of the idea that rather than having a assigned precinct polling place, you go to that one place and that's where you vote. And if you show up at the wrong place, they turn you away. That there were fewer locations, but folks can vote at any location in the jurisdiction. They tend to be a little larger, but that people could vote, for example, at any polling place in St. Louis County.
Can I add one quick point to what Anita just mentioned? So kind of for marketing purposes in St. Louis County, we don't call it vote centers, we call it vote anywhere. That's what all of our materials say, vote anywhere. So it's a little more intuitive for voters. If you ask somebody on my staff if we have vote centers in St. Louis County, they would probably say, I don't know what a vote center is, but you can vote anywhere. So just to add.
Great marketing. So security, right? So when you think about what's the biggest factor in what causes breakdowns in election processes, the human factor, right? And so the more voting locations that you have, the more humans you have involved in it, right? And then you get spread thin, right? When you're going through your training and your recruiting efforts, you're identifying who are our best supervisors we call them inspectors in Arizona, but then they're best supervisors of the voting location, right? And then you're weeding out others, right? And then the locations that tend to run the best are run because you have a really good supervisor of that voting location. So it allows you to enhance your training and really hone in on, okay, where are the people that we have to like really invest in training and get them knowledgeable about all of our processes and get them to be able to run a really tight ship at the voting location. And you start eliminating like the low-hanging fruit, right? The people that maybe aren't the best inspectors, right? Through all your evaluations. And so one of the ways you improve and enhance security is you have fewer humans involved. The humans that you do have involved are better trained, more experienced, and running the locations, right? And then all those other factors like that Eric was sort of alluding to, the unknowns that you have with all those different voting locations, right? That could go wrong, and you having to move voting locations in the middle of election day, and all those types of things that, right? The chain of custody now that you have to maintain, and not having and getting accountability for pre-printed ballots. You no longer have pre-printed ballots, most likely, if you're going to be using ballot on demand printers, right? And then you're printing ballots on demand, and you can have the chain of custody of only the ballots that were printed for that single voter, right, are printed, and you don't have to worry about what those loose ballots being out there in the universe. So those are just some of the reasons and ways that it improves security. I could probably go into a few others, but I don't know. Do you want to ask Eric that as well, Kyle, or do you have something else for Eric?
I
Eric,
would
if you want to, oh yeah,
and
please.
say I think everything Scott said was absolutely accurate, but there's also a perception issue. If a person has a good experience voting, they tend to think that their voting is secure. They feel more confident that their vote's going to be counted correctly. And so if they're going to polling places that Eric said used to not run so great, but now are running more smoothly, they can look at the app and go to a place with a short wait time. They're not getting turned away for being at the wrong polling place. They don't have to cast a provisional ballot. That also increases their perception of voter confidence and security.
I'll just add real quick on the politics of this. Our surveys of voters in Fresno and St. Louis County found vote centers are very popular. They're equally popular and liked by Republicans and Democrats. And I think, don't want to jinx things, but I think, like the resilience piece is very powerful. And I think there are features of vote centers that appeal to both sides of the aisle, if you will. Efficiency, maybe cost reductions, access, a whole variety of features that I think appeal to different folks. I know a lot of election features are very politically contested and partisan, but this seems to be one that's not.
I don't really have anything to add to that. Those are all great responses. So I know we have a lot more questions. I'll let you go to those.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was what David and Anita just added, I think is a great tee up for a couple questions, which are all about communication with voters about vote centers. What strategies have been most effective for voter education? How early do you need to start getting the word out about vote centers? Particular interest in free tools or low-cost tools that can be used to spread the word. Um, Scott, Jarrett, any thoughts?
So, the biggest, I think, hurdle that anyone that's implementing it now is gonna have to overcome is most likely you're reducing the number of locations when you go to vote centers, because of all the added technology that's involved to make a vote center functional or vote anywhere location, functional, um, and all then the support that that will need. So communicating why there's fewer, right? And what we really did was it was we weren't going from 550 to 100. We were going from 1 to 100, right? Because now voters had 100 options to choose from. So just changing that perspective and then also really focusing in on they can vote when they're out running an errand. They can vote when it's nearby their work, right? They can vote when nearby their children's school, all those different avenues and options that it improves on making it more convenient for voters. So those are the things that I would focus on with the public, right? And then you're going to have a robust website, right? Where you have your voting locations listed, people can have access to it. You'll have to think about flyers that you produce in your for your poll workers. Like we always have our 5 closest vote centers flyer that our poll workers have that they're able to, if a vote center, because you still have vote centers sometimes not open up, rarely now, but there might be something, a fire in them. Then the poll workers have the handout that they can issue to voters and say, here's our 5 closest voting locations, right? One of the other things that we had to do to convince our board that because we're going from 550 to 99 is where are people going to turn out? And I think I saw a comment about this. And where are you deciding to place your vote centers? And so we ended up hiring county employees from other departments, and we called them our whiteboard attendees. Right. And so I went through and said, okay, these are the areas based on prior patterns where we have high in-person voting locations, right? Precincts with high voting. I just don't feel like we have enough. And then I had in our command center a group of people that just managed, and we had 20 teams of these whiteboard attendees, and they stood at the end of the line, right? Because we figured once someone makes a commitment to stand in line, they're not leaving the line, right? And so they had these whiteboards and they wrote the 5 closest locations and what the wait times were at each of those other locations and what the wait time was at this current location, right? And then if there was no wait time at that, we could then reassign them, right? And those 2 individuals would then drive to the next location that had. And so that's what we used in 2020 in both the primary and general. We no longer use that because our website functions so well. But we had to do that to get over the hurdle of letting our elected board of supervisors approve vote centers.
Yeah, I think Scott's right. It depends on when you're trying to implement this. Again, I think we had a little more grace because of COVID. In our case, we spent relatively little in terms of hard dollars and paying for advertisement or anything. We relied really on earned media and on the sample ballot mailings we already send out to voters. We just added on to those, a little spot on those mailings about it. And like Scott said, we include on our sample ballot mailer the 5 closest polling locations to that voter's home precinct. And we have a very robust lookup tool on our website that, as David said earlier, receives hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of hits depending on the election. The one thing I would add, again, it depends on your local political culture, but especially if you're going to ease into this concept, you don't, I don't think, this is my opinion, you don't have to put a lot of energy into trying to educate voters on this because they really can't do it wrong. If they end up going to, if you still have a lot of the same polling locations open, if they end up going to the same old place, that's fine. And folks kind of learn through word of mouth or doing it over time after several elections, like, learning from their neighbors or the people at the polling location. Oh yeah, I could have gone down the street. So um, it's situational, but that was our experience.
Scott anticipated the next question in the Q&A that I was going to ask, but Eric, I want to give you a chance to answer it as well, which is uh, this initial move to vote centers from precinct-based voting. One of the challenges that this person flags is that first time that you're running vote centers, one of the initial challenges is predicting where people are going to choose to vote, allocating your resources appropriately. Scott already talked a bit about what his office did to do that in the 2020 election. Eric, can you talk a little bit about your experience with that first election?
Yeah, we frankly we did not worry too much about that because we understood that if there's a particular place that is much more popular than the others, we also, like Scott did, we had flyers made up for each polling location that listed the five closest other polling locations to that. And so we had high school students at each polling location that in Missouri can work as regular poll workers, and that was kind of their job, is to monitor the line, track the line, and then pass out those flyers if the line got long to tell people, hey, you can go to these other places. But folks seem to be pretty receptive to that. Like if the line gets long, you just tell them, hey, if you want to go down the street, you can. The option is yours. And that just took a lot of mental pressure off of me as an election administrator. Like, yeah, if there's a big line, it's kind of like water. It will find the path of least resistance. It'll flow to where there isn't a line.
The one thing that those whiteboard attendees reported back to us, um, people didn't like, we had some locations that had 45, 50-minute waits, and 2 miles away there was a 5-minute wait. And people wouldn't leave. Like they're like, it's a presidential election. 50 minutes, I'll wait in line. Right. So that actually, so those are data points. And over again, that's what the whiteboard attendees were reporting back to us, is they didn't mind, right? Because right now we're hypersensitive. You're like, oh my goodness, our wait times are 35 minutes. This is too long. But the voters that are standing in the lines are telling the people that are working, that are trying to give them an option to find a shorter line, and they didn't mind. Right now, some might, but I, like they said, the vast majority, like they could not count on their hand uh, any instances of people that were actually leave the line, even before they made the commitment to stand in it.
Gotta love the tenacity of casting your ballot. We are running short on time, so I want to squeeze in a couple more questions here. Several, and I'm going to start by combining several, which is folks asking variations on. It sounds like both of you offer vote centers for both early voting and voting on election day, and there are a number of officials in the chat who are flagging that their jurisdiction only allows it during early voting, not on election day, or they're trying to do both, or they aren't offering both. Can you talk, are there any differences in your experience between your vote centers on election day versus your vote centers during the early voting period?
In our case, we just have many more options on election day. We only have generally speaking, 14 early voting locations. It's for a 2-week period, and we have close to 250 locations on election day itself. So there are many more options on election day for people, and there are lookup tools on our website, one for early voting, one for election day, that people use quite a bit. But no, because we're using vote centers for both. We don't really have to switch gears, which is nice.
Yeah, I'd say Eric's mostly right. In Maricopa County, well, Arizona, we only allow tabulation on site during election day. So that is one nuance that's different. But pretty much everything else runs exactly the same. And then also your election night closing procedures. So during early voting, because we don't have an on-site tabulator and voters are putting their ballot into an affidavit envelope that they've signed, we don't have to bring everything back every single night during early voting. Like we have courier teams go out to a voting location every single day, but they may make their route and stop at one, stop at another at 2, stop at another at 3. So but voters don't really know the difference there. But that's one other change just from an administration standpoint.
Um,
I'll just
yes.
add real quick. Early in-person voting is growing rapidly around the country, and I think in the vast majority of places, it's a vote anywhere model, maybe with many fewer locations. I think if what we're seeing, where we've studied vote centers holds, I think, be prepared for citizens to get used to the early voting experience. Oh, I can go anywhere. Early voting, why can't I vote anywhere on election day? Like be prepared for more of those questions from voters, I think.
Yeah. That's a really salient point. It is probably going to be our last question, unfortunately, because there are so many I want to get to. But you've all talked about staffing in past webinars that TJ and I have done in the series. But staffing and training those poll workers has come up time and time again. And I do want to kind of end on that human note. You've talked about some of the challenges, some of the things you look for in your poll workers for vote centers. Any tips, any best practices, any recommendations for finding those creme de la creme poll workers or getting those staff to the right location to make sure that things run smoothly? Yeah,
I don't know that
Scott,
this is necessarily a vote center versus precinct type. I mean, other than you're recruiting fewer poll workers in a vote center model. Premium poll worker training, right? Try to implement that in your off cycles where you can spend longer amounts of time, have some sort of certification program through that. That's where you really get to know your poll workers a lot better. Like ours is 2 full days, 16 hours of training, and we have them have to pass exams to move forward to be an inspector at a voting location. During elections, we have, in addition to our standard poll worker trainings, we'll have inspector workshops where we have just inspectors that have to attend, and we find that that's a lot of cross-informational sharing between the inspectors. And then if you're a new inspector, you have to go to another workshop. And then we've really taken advantage of computer-based training. So we have 5 hours of computer-based training content that require poll workers to take in addition to their hands-on learning, which is 2 hours. So those are strategies that we've used for training.
If anybody knows the silver bullet to finding consistent poll workers every election, please let me know what it is. I think Scott's exactly right. I don't really have much to add to his response. I think if you have the opportunity to reduce the number of polling locations, that generally allows you to reduce the number of poll workers you need, which should allow you to, be a little more selective in those that you pick. And to some extent, vote centers have allowed us to do that. The last point I want to make is not necessarily about poll workers, but just vote centers in general. I think they don't make sense for everybody all the time. If you are a jurisdiction, especially like small rural jurisdictions, a lot of my colleagues in Missouri, it frankly doesn't make sense for them. They have 1 or 2 ballot styles. They have just a handful of polling locations throughout the county that are spread relatively far apart. And they don't have electronic poll books, or at least not ones that are networked. They just pre-print their ballots. And vote centers probably don't make a lot of sense in those situations. But if you're from a larger jurisdiction where a lot of people go to the wrong polling location on election day and your law allows it, it's really something to look into. You do have to have your ducks in a row in terms of technology. You have to have the wherewithal to manage it. You probably need networked electronic poll books, and you need to use either ballot marking devices or ballot printing on demand at the location. So those are just kind of the high level things. And because I tell the other folks in Missouri when they ask about it that, you shouldn't try to fit a square peg in a round hole all the time, but it makes a lot of sense if what we've talked about today makes sense to you, then, consider it for your jurisdiction.
Well, thank you all so much. Rebecca, I'll hand it back to you to close us out, but it's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Great. Yes, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Huge thank you again to our panelists. This was a great discussion. I learned a ton. I've been taking notes in the background. I don't think we had any resources to put into the chat today, but if y'all have any questions or would like to reach out to any of our panelists, you can send us an email at support@electionsgroup.com. And we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.